Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very pleased to share my conversation that I had with Kyle Harper. Kyle is a historian of ancient Rome, and his interests are in disease history, economic history, and environmental history. He's an alumnus of the University of Oklahoma, where he's also been on the faculty there since 2007. And he's written 4 books. The most recent is Plagues Upon the Earth, and that is what we talk about in this conversation. He starts out by talking about his reasons and motives for writing the book. He talks about his 2 main theses of the book, the 5 taxa of pathology, importance of globalization, both past and present. Talk about 3 components of parasitism. Talk about the importance of hunter-gatherer humans in the Pleistocene and how disease functioned in this period. We talked about what vector-borne transmission diseases are. Talked about some of the changes in the Agrarian period and the importance of fecal-oral transmission for disease history. We talked about typhoid disease as an example of density in domesticates in an agrarian society. We talk about measles and how that spreads with humans through the respiratory tract and how it's one of the most contagious diseases in the world. We, of course, talk about zoonotic leaps and the impact of rats and bats. We talk about the plague and its complicated history. We talk about the Colombian exchange, talk about the impact of the slave trade. We talk about modernity and how modernity has continued to work in the evolution of diseases. We talk about public health innovations in the modern age, vaccines, and of course, COVID-19. We talk about COVID-19 not really at all, and that mostly follows Kyle's motivation, which was he started writing this book in 2017. And it's not a COVID book, and he got maybe halfway through, and the pandemic hit, and so the book kind of reads that way. And so we mostly talk about where COVID-19 kind of sits within this larger history of disease. The book is very good. It is a very good book, but it is very rich with information. Anytime you're writing a big history book, you're going to get just lots and lots and lots of information. So the conversation kind of follows that too. There's a lot of information in this conversation, and I couldn't be more pleased with it. I really do feel the conversation is a good representation of his book, and you could walk away listening to this conversation and get the main, I think, structure of his book, and hopefully go out and buy it. So now I bring you Kyle Harper. I'm here with Kyle Harper. Kyle, thanks so much for agreeing to come on the podcast. I'm really excited to talk with you about your new book.
Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. So before we get into it, just tell folks who you are, what you do, and a little bit about your research and your book.
I'm a historian. I'm trained as an ancient historian. Most of my research has focused on ancient Rome. And when I wrote my last book, not this current book, I got really into a series of disease outbreaks in the Roman Empire. And I'm generally interested in the history of health and disease, but I just got captivated by the fact that in the later centuries of Roman history, a huge number of sources describe these really mass mortality events, the giant plagues and pestilences. And that just absolutely captivated me. And in combination with the fact that we're actually learning a lot of genuinely new stuff about history, and including ancient history, from genetics.
Yeah.
That has a lot to tell us about the history of human populations, but also microbes. I just got on this research track and wanted to understand where the Roman pandemics fit in the big picture of history. So I started writing a book on the history of infectious disease about 2017. And obviously when I started it, I had no idea. Well, I knew there was going to be a pandemic someday, but I didn't actually think it was going to happen by the time I was on about chapter 5 or 6. And that was surreal, but also certainly motivating to try and write a book that suddenly had a little more urgency than it had when I started. I'm sure it'll in some ways look like a COVID book, but it actually wasn't conceived as a COVID book. It was supposed to warn the world that from a historian's perspective, we were going to have a pandemic, but didn't get there quite in time.
Yeah, I was thinking that when I first got the book, I said, "Oh, I wonder if this is one of those new books that was kind of, writing it as it was happening." I know Nick Christakis did that with Apollo Zero, and he kind of had a more kind of public health medical angle. But so then when I saw it, it's like in 2017 you had started writing it. I said, "Oh," which was actually kind of cool because it didn't really kind of color, like COVID wasn't looming over the book for a lot of it, which was, there's a kind of purity to that, which is nice. And I actually was, as I was reading it, I was like, well, I wonder how he'll mention it, right? I know people edit and stuff like that. And you really only mention it, I think, in the last chapter, last couple pages, really. It really is a history book. It's not really about what's going on momently.
That's right. I had to tweak a couple of sentences in the introduction that were kind of framed a little bit differently. And then I added a few pages on COVID at the end, but I also kind of use a cop out and say I'm a historian, not a journalist or a futurist, and I like to have a little perspective to write about the past rather than the present. But obviously, it's important and it's relevant to understand that COVID didn't come out of nowhere, that it really does fit into certain historical patterns. So I end up at COVID, but certainly didn't know that when I started writing.
Yeah. Well, for listeners, the book is called Plagues Upon the Earth, Disease and the Course of Human History. That's a great title. It's got a very beautiful cover. It's a large book, but I like large books. But I will say, you have, as most good historians have, about 200 pages of references and notes and things like that, which is always very nice to see. You definitely did your homework on this. So it's
I'm a historian. Fantastic. We've got to back up our.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is absolutely fantastic. I really, really, really enjoyed it, and everyone should read it. So,
thank you.
The book is divided into 4 big sections, which is basically how I've kind of structured our conversation today. It's a nice way of going through it. So obviously, it's very, very a lot of rich in information, so we won't hit everything. So I tried to really kind of extract the biggest pieces from each of the main sections. So we may spend some time more on others, but I guess I want to start with the main thesis of the book. So in the first part of the book, the fire section, kind of all the way back into the various periods of the earth, kind of the origins of disease and plague. And your main thesis for the book, as I understand it, is that the history of disease is interconnected with us as humans. And so I don't know if I'm exactly reading that right, but if so, how did you come to that thesis? And is there any other alternatives for the proliferation of, disease without human involvement?
Well, I try and look at human history the way a scientist might, somebody who studies ecology and particularly the ecology of infectious disease. And I think that's a helpful way to think about our species. Sometimes we have a tendency to think that we're kind of apart from nature when really we're part of nature, we're a force of nature. And you can actually, I think, understand our story more deeply if you turn some of the tools of the natural sciences to think about the rise and spread of humanity. And the one way to frame that is to think of the fact that infectious diseases are pervasive in nature. Every organism is exploited by some kind of parasite that's trying to take advantage of it. And so we're no different than any other animal. And you can actually, I think, kind of get a sense of how unique the human disease pool is by comparing us to our closest relatives in nature, other primates, and particularly other great apes like chimpanzees. And chimps have lots of infectious diseases compared to most animals, but the number that we have dwarfs chimp populations. And whereas 100,000 years ago, chimps living in equatorial forests in Africa probably had not exactly the same diseases they have today, but probably a pretty similar portfolio. Our ancestors 100,000 years ago had a completely different portfolio of parasites than what we endure today. And there was no plague or smallpox or measles or typhoid or go on, tuberculosis. And those diseases are a product of our history. And so in a sense, one of the theses of the book, the kind of two big theses are, one, that our germs are a product of our history, because human technology changes the environment and germs respond, they evolve and adapt to us under the conditions that we create. So our disease pool is a product of what we've done as a species. And then two, unlike most other animals, humans have highly variable diseases in both time and space. And this is, again, a little bit different from, say, other primates that have different populations, can have slightly different disease pools, but the human disease pool is very different over space in different places, and highly variable over time. It changes, there are sudden explosive disease outbreaks, diseases come, they go extinct. And I think that's a really integral part of our history. And so not only do we create our diseases, but then these diseases, and particularly the patterns of change in disease, really affect human societies. So we make our germs, and then our germs really shape our trajectory.
Yeah, it's an interesting. Both of those theses are really interesting because I think for the common person, they probably wouldn't consider it that way. They would just be like, oh, these things happen, or maybe there's human involvement. But I think you kind of setting the compass from the beginning of this is how the kind of lens to look at it kind of really gives you, as you're kind of reading through the book and looking at the history of this kind of symbiosis of how disease works with humans and humans with disease. In the beginning, you give the kind of 5 taxa of pathogens, which I think may be helpful. I hadn't really looked at it this way, so it's really educational for me too. Which are the fungi, helminths, protozoa, bacteria, and viruses. And I think a lot of people probably get some of those confused. Just kind of give us the brief snapshot of those 5 and how they're a little different.
Yeah, there's a little bit of fundamental biology of infectious disease, because it's important to understand who these agents of disease are. And they really, they're an unruly cast of characters. They're also different. And I think it's important to kind of understand their biology, to understand the relationship with us. Obviously, viral diseases are caused by viruses that are little passive entities. They're nothing more than some DNA or RNA that's closed in protein, and that really aren't alive. They don't do anything on their own. They just invade our cells and get inserted into our genetic machinery. Viruses are amazing in their simplicity, but they're also really potentially quite devastating. And viruses cause measles, smallpox, AIDS, and of course, COVID-19. So viral diseases account for really quite a disproportionate part of infectious disease in the human past and present. Bacteria are bigger, they're alive, they're single-celled microbes. Most bacteria are everywhere. Viruses and bacteria are pervasive in the environment, in and on our bodies. Most bacteria are perfectly content environmental organisms and want nothing to do with you except maybe to exploit your waste. But they're not pathogens. Really, a small, tiny fraction of bacteria actually are dedicated to lifestyles that require them to cause disease. But the ones that do cause disease in humans also account for some of our really worst afflictions. So plague, cholera, tuberculosis are major bacterial diseases. And a lot of the fecal-oral diseases that I think we'll talk about are bacterial. So those are kind of the two big ones, but it's really important to fill out the roster, and particularly organisms that are sometimes called protozoa, single-celled organisms with a nucleus. So they're a little bit closer in the tree of life to animals than bacteria are. But these don't cause a huge number of diseases in humans, but the ones they cause are some of the most important diseases, and particularly the group of organisms that cause malaria, different forms of malarial disease, which is a vector-borne disease transmitted by mosquito bite that is really one of the 3 or 4 most important diseases for understanding the history of infectious disease in the human past. So viruses, bacteria, protozoa. Then there's a couple of others that are important. One is fungi. These are again everywhere, all around us, on us, in us, mostly not doing too much damage. Unfortunately, for people who are immunocompromised, sometimes their body can't fend off fungi, and there are threats that that highly pathogenic and drug-resistant fungi could evolve. But the reality is that fungi haven't caused a great burden of human disease in the past, so they don't get a ton of play in the book. But the last group, which is really a kind of a catch-all, it's not an exact taxonomic category, but are helminths, which is just a Greek word for worm. It's just a fancy way of saying worms, and these are often macroscopic. So everything we've talked about so far is microbial, microscopic. Worms are sometimes really grossly big. These are sometimes just called parasites. That's one connotation of the word parasite in English, is sometimes these macro parasites that are still a big burden on human health, and particularly throughout our past have been a major source of disease. And agents like hookworm, which is probably the most important helminth disease historically, but a range of others that cause really nasty diseases in humans, often which they don't have the same kind of place in our, I think, collective mentality or imagination, particularly in the privileged societies that like we inhabit, where they're pretty marginal. But in underdeveloped societies, and particularly throughout our past, diseases like hookworm infection, but others that are really don't have the notoriety they deserve, like lymphatic filariasis, which is a major disease in past times, that are an important part of the story. So that's kind of the cast of characters and all their diversity.
Yeah, no, that's super instructive, because I think, again, the major ones are kind of viruses and bacteria, but if you go to certain regions in the world, you still see some of these, with protozoa or helminths that are also still prevalent. So I do think it's an important distinction. You explain it well in the book. We'll talk about it. This is basically the outline of the book, but you talk about how globalization was a key component to disease. I don't know if you just kind of want to give a preamble to why that's a component to disease, and then we'll talk about all the different periods,
Right. Well, I mean, I think two thoughts. One is we need to think of globalization in really big picture terms. I think when we hear globalization, we kind of think of, McDonald's in Moscow and American movies that are seen all over the world. And that's characteristic of the very most recent phase of globalization, driven by telecommunications and jet travel. But there's a much deeper history of globalization that includes a longer story about humans developing long-range transport technologies, like domesticating horses that allow our species to be really interconnected. Transoceanic sailing is obviously a huge one. And so in the book, I try and situate this longer story of globalization that tries to account for some of these really big shifts in human connectivity that go deeper than the last generation, that go into the 19th century with railroads and steamships, that go into the period of transatlantic sail, that go into the period of old world unification, and empires like the Mongols that connect huge parts of the old world, and to take that story deeper. And then second, this obviously has a lot to tell us as historians who are trying to think of human history in terms of disease ecology, because globalization is just a story about connection of human populations. And anytime you connect populations, you're connecting they're infectious diseases, they're parasites. So every time we've invented a transportation technology or brought human populations into closer connectivity, it's had effects on human health and disease.
Yeah, I think that's really important to know that globalization isn't just a modern feature, but that there's globalization has been happening at different points in history or human history, which would not be excluded from understanding how we understand the spread of disease through time and space with humans. Going back to the piece about chimps and humans, you talk about earlier on in the book how some of the early kinds of pathogens that were around RSV, pneumoni, there's a spillover from in different species of germs, right? So my question when I was reading this was, well, why do we get some viruses that were harmful for chimps but not for humans, and vice versa? So there are many things that are harmful or less harmful for humans, but would absolutely decimate, our cousins. So is that just an evolved nature of us as humans, or is there interventions, or is there something else of why it's not a kind of one-to-one kind of thing, even though we're similar in relation?
Well, yeah, there's a couple of things going on. One is just that microbes are always moving around between different species of host, and sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail, but they're always trying. And so the transmission of bacteria, viruses, protozoa between different species of animals is just a pervasive part of nature. And because humans and other mammals generally, and primates in particular, have relatively similar biology and relatively similar immune systems, it's kind of a particularly high risk situation when pathogens cross the species barrier between us and other close relatives in the animal kingdom. And it goes both ways. So you're alluding to the fact that today, great ape populations are really threatened by human diseases. We have so many infectious diseases, and when we give them to chimpanzees or other primate populations, it can sometimes be very devastating for our primate kin. And so actually over the last generation, there's been a lot of efforts to try and do what can be done to make sure that chimps, for instance, that are being observed by scientists aren't catching the colds that inevitably humans carry in their chests and their blood. And there's been some progress in that, but when it breaks down, and even some relatively moderate respiratory pathogens get from humans to other primates, it can be very, very dangerous to wildlife. And it goes the other way as well. We get diseases from them that can find a way to adapt to our biology and our immune systems and sort of crack the code and infect us, which is hard to do. Our immune systems are very powerful. But the tragic example of the 20th century is HIV, which is a primate disease, really, both of monkeys and of apes, and crosses really multiple times. It's 7 or 8 times that we know of from primates into humans, and causes just tremendous mortality in human populations in the 20th and 21st century. But that's been going on for a long time, and there are other diseases that threaten to move from primates to humans. Malaria, in much deeper time, is caused by protozoa that have many different species. Some infect birds, but a lot infect mammals in general, and primates in particular. And human species of malaria seem to have evolved from ancestors that infected other great apes. So there's a really deep story about the fundamental relationship of human health and animal health.
Yeah, it's very fascinating to me. I thought more and more about it, when I was reading the book about we are for mammals and our evolutionary tree, it's so interesting how for humans, some can really knock us out and for others not. And then vice versa for, when it comes to our primates or primate cousins, or for, anything about bats or rodents. It's, it's so interesting where it falls along in the tree. One question I wanted to ask, because it comes up over and over in the book, and I think it's kind of goes back to one of the central theses, is that a main theme is that large amounts of people in close quarters spread viruses and disease. But you described early on that it's not simply the number, right? So it's not like you have a million here or something like that alone, right? So it's not the number of individuals in a group, but more so of how they act in the evolutionary environment. And so I think this is the piece here where you talk about the three general principles of parasitism. So could you just explain parasitism, and then also how the environmental components interact with large groups of people?
Well, I try and think of human populations from the perspective of a parasite, and whether you're a virus or a bacteria, we can, for the sake of simplicity, anthropomorphize them, sort of
Sure.
realize it's just easier to talk about them trying to do things. Of course, they don't have intentions or consciousness, but but ultimately they're trying, quote, to spread their genes. And how are they going to do it? Well, for viruses, by hacking into our cells; for bacteria, by invading our bodies and stealing our energy and nutrients, and using it to replicate themselves. But they've got, it's a really challenging lifestyle. I mean, I'm not asking you to give them any sympathy, but life's hard for a parasite. You got to get around your host's immune system, which usually involves some tricks and fakery. You got to reproduce, but you can't reproduce so much that you just kill your host right away. And then the really big problem is you got to get from one host to the next, or at least your descendants, your offspring, have to get to that next host. And that's really hard to do. There's only a few ways to do it. You can do it the respiratory route, so via aerosols or droplets. You can do it via the fecal-oral route. This is a tried and true highway of germ transmission, is that pathogens can infect the gut, and they're passed out by the millions and billions in feces, and find their way from there, either via contaminated water or food or dirty fingers, into the mouth of a next victim. So the fecal-oral route is a second route. Sexual transmission is another. It's actually really hard to be a sexually transmitted parasite, because the basic problem is you have to survive in one host long enough to get into the next. And that's really hard to do because our immune systems are really good. So in the grand scheme of things, there are probably fewer sexually transmitted parasites than any of the other routes. But the ones that there are, like AIDS and syphilis, are particularly devastating diseases. And then finally, there's vector-borne transmission. And this is one of the most important ways in which parasites have figured out, how do I solve my problem of getting my offspring into the next host? And it's by hitching a ride on fleas and lice and ticks, and above all, mosquitoes. And so these are the main routes of horizontal transmission, of getting from one host to the next. And so anything we do as a population or as a species to change our relationship with the environment and each other that helps or hinders pathogens trying to solve those basic problems of how do I get around an immune system? How do I cause enough of an infection to find my way into the next host? Anything that alters their prospects or opportunities will drive evolution.
Yeah, I think that's really important to know, because I think that there's basically multiple avenues, right? So if you're, again, putting ourselves in the parasite's mind, they're trying to get around all this stuff, and there's multiple ways that can happen, whether it's fecal-oral transmission, the vector-borne ways. There's all these different ways, which for us, for what we know from modern science at this point, is to try and say we have to do a good job of being clean, having good hygiene habits, so that way, there's a lot of unknown forces trying to make us, not intentionally sick. And it's just interesting how there's these just different ways in which it will try to kind of spawn. And so if you're in a pretty dirty environment, or an environment that's not so good, and there's lots of people, then there's just more opportunities. So I guess mitigating kind of the opportunities for parasites to thrive.
Exactly. And I think more than we're even really ever conscious of, we're grooming and cleaning ourselves. We're altering our household environments. We're chemically disinfecting environments in ways that have really evolved. I should say, that's a metaphor here. Our societies have adapted all of these different routines and mechanisms that try and protect us against pathogens.
Yeah. One of the things that, in terms of our evolutionary history, is you talk about the Homo genus, right? So we're, part of, there's Australopithecus, there's Homo erectus, there's, obviously Homo sapiens, and many others, Denisovans. There's many groups of humans. And you talk about Homo erectus, and they're really important because they were one of the precursors to current humans, of how they spread the earth and they start walking around and they started doing a bunch of different things. And so they also had bigger brains, better use of tools, harnessing fire was super important, and how to consume energy through metabolism and combustion. And that's what kind of, those things at that time in history, evolutionary history, set us apart from all the other apes. Do you think that all those differences and how we evolved is what made us more prone to some diseases and less prone to others relative to chimps, or do you think it was something else?
Well, I certainly think that that we can trace our distinct history back before we were even really completely us. So, as you say, the human or hominin disease pool is shaped in ways that go back from the very beginnings of truly hominin history, and the rise of a large brain, highly social, technology wielding ape is the kind of beginning of a really distinctive disease pool. And so I try and take the story as hard as it is, because it gets trickier the further back you go, but to put the rise of Homo sapiens in a somewhat even deeper perspective, because our lineage, the modern humans, come out of different lineages of archaic humans. They're already doing some pretty amazing things in terms of their use of technology, and particularly, as you say, fire, which is really the mastery of fire, is this amazing technology that gives ancestral hominins control over nature and power to reshape nature that I think, arguably no other species has. And when you reshape nature, when you reshape ecological circumstances, you're going to be triggering microbial evolution. So I think there's an important way in which the story of human disease is actually even older than Homo sapiens.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. It's interesting how it was really nice reading your perspective on history. All of these things are so interesting now, because I've talked to a handful of different folks in their field, and I talked to Jeremy De Silva, who wrote a book on bipedalism and why that was like super important. I take it for granted. All of us take it for granted, but it's like that was a huge step for how we were able to do different things, freeing up our hands and many other things. I had a conversation with Patrick Roberts, who he wrote a book called Jungle, and how tropical forests throughout time really influenced us as humans. And it was having all that in back of my head and reading. I
just started it. It's good.
Yeah, it's good, right? It's a fantastic book. How all of that, and then I'm reading what you're saying about like, how did also early humans, their different lifestyles and changes impact how the spread of disease happened or not. It's so nice to see different people from their respective disciplines looking at similar periods or similar parts of our evolutionary past and saying, here's more of a kind of a robust amount of information that can tell us more things about early hominins. And I think it's you do a really nice job of trying to explain where the pattern of disease progression happened. And so, which leads us to is it a Pleistocene, right? A period of the Earth where humans are now populating the world, or starting to, right? Moving from Africa, and for a long time, and people have sort of kind of I don't say romanticized, but there are many interesting ideas that people have about early humans as hunter-gatherers, and that we have at least three groups still around that have a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, which you talk about. And so they're typically seen as healthy, but they also have low life expectancy. And so I guess in terms of hunter-gatherers, specifically in the Pleistocene, what are the major lessons that we can learn about diseases from humans, past or present, that have a hunter-gatherer lifestyle?
Well, it's important, if we're trying to really tell the history of humanity, that we give proper attention to the long period of our past in which we didn't have agriculture. So Homo sapiens is probably upwards of 300,000 years old. And we've had farming, the domestication of livestock and plants, for only about 10,000 years of that history. So that means we spent 290,000 of our 300,000 years as hunter-gatherers, as foragers who are taking energy from the environment rather than making energy in the form of crops or livestock. So there are really fundamental differences in the ecology of hunter-gatherer societies. And I do think farming was, on the whole, really, really bad for human health. But that sort of caused us to just sort of fast forward over the other 290,000 years of our history. And I think that's giving up too much. It's missing too much of the story. And there's really important dimensions of the formation of a human disease pool that go back into the Pleistocene, which is the geological period that precedes the Holocene, the last 10,000 years, the age of farming and civilizations. And human hunter-gatherer societies really had a lot of diseases. Now, they had different diseases, and there were limits because populations were, one, small, and two, mobile. And so there's something really important about that kind of traditional image of them as healthier than farming societies. But even so, relative to other species, they have lots of pathogens. And I think we're now starting to see that there was really a more eventful Pleistocene history of germs that we're only starting to really, I think, get a fuller picture of from the genetics of different microorganisms. But diseases that are really important, like Plasmodium vivax, the microbial agent of one of the two most prevalent forms of malaria, is really certainly a Pleistocene disease. And so we need to try and understand this really long phase of the human past without just saying, look, they were healthier than farmers, even if they were healthier than farmers.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that there is a lot of work with population genetics that's trying to understand, like, well, what was life like for such a long part of our history? And it's, as we get good with, or get better with technology and trying to understand that, it sounds like more answers are coming out. You talk about some of the precursors. I guess there's a precursor to malaria. Is there any other kinds of infectious diseases that were around in the Pleistocene that we know of, or what are relevant for today, I guess?
Right. I mean, certainly other vector-borne diseases besides malaria, like lymphatic filariasis, would have been around in the Pleistocene. And then there are sort of neglected diseases like schistosomiasis, which is a disease that's caused by a helminth that requires a complex life cycle that depends on a phase of its life of growth in a freshwater snail. So it's really confined to environments that are near freshwater, mostly in the tropics, ranging into the subtropics. And we know that that's a Pleistocene disease. So because of our growing understanding of the genetics of these pathogens that tells us about their evolutionary history, we can often get at least a rough sense, not a precise one, but a crude but meaningful sense of how old some of these pathogens are, and it's becoming evident that that some really important diseases were around for our Ice Age ancestors.
Yeah. On that note, you towards the end of the first part, you mentioned three infectious diseases: malaria, lymphatic filariasis, and sleeping sickness. The last two most people haven't heard of, but you say why that's maybe a disservice. We should know a little bit more about that, or talk about it a little bit more. And I think before you talk about that, talk about you mentioned it, the vector-borne transmission, and why that's important, because we'll mention malaria later. But it's with we have some people that are some travelers, right? So ticks, flies, mosquitoes is a big one. So just talk about briefly the overview of that transmission, and then you can talk about the three infectious diseases.
Yeah, there's a range of really important vector-borne diseases in humans. Some are transmitted by mosquitoes, like malaria, lymphatic filariasis, as we mentioned. Some are and yellow fever, dengue fever, chikungunya fever, others. Mm-hmm. There are some really important diseases transmitted by lice, most notably typhus. Mm-hmm. There are really important diseases transmitted by ticks, including some that are still very much a problem in the United States, like Lyme disease and Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And these are diseases that are caused by organisms that have really figured out a neat evolutionary trick. It's a hard one to pull off, because you have to be able to survive or subvert two different immune systems, which again is it's hard to deal with one. I mean, our immune systems are so clever and so powerful that they manage to fend off all of the weak kind of efforts that are constantly going on. And a pathogen that figures out how to navigate an immune defense is pretty rare and hard to do in evolutionary terms. But vector-borne pathogens have to do it twice with two very different immune systems. And mosquitoes and fleas and lice and ticks have immune systems, simpler ones, but still, it's no small feat. But the payoff is really big, because then you've got assisted transport and often direct access into very vulnerable sterile blood or tissue beyond our barriers, like skin or mucosa. So for those that have figured out how to do it, they really reap the rewards. And these diseases also have the advantage, they're just very good at transmitting, but they're also advantaged in that they can transmit in less dense populations. So whereas a lot of like respiratory diseases or gastrointestinal diseases require or certainly benefit strongly from density, vector-borne diseases, because they have access via an insect or arthropod intermediary, they can kind of survive and not go extinct in populations that are maybe less dense or more mobile. So many of these diseases are quite old and probably go back to our pre-farming days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that many people have spilt a lot of ink on how the mosquito is, just one of the most, potentially, dangerous kinds of ways for humans. I mean, especially in certain areas, and like you're saying,
still the deadliest animal in the world.
Yeah, I mean, because it what you're saying, it doesn't need to have large groups of people. I mean, it can survive, and it's it's crazy how much devastation that's done for so many people in so many parts of the world. So it's still a puzzle of how we can interact with mosquitoes and and not die from them. So so I guess moving to the second part of the book is we start talking about farming. So we kind of move out of hunter-gatherer age and we start moving into the agricultural age. So I'm just going to tee this up here, this big question. So the first thing is that there's two parts, I guess, but agriculture and the Holocene, so the period after, impacted, growth. So there's more people, resources, human ingenuity, et cetera. And you talk about in the book really nicely about how humans domesticated plants and animals, wheat, beans, potatoes, et cetera. And that was super important for our growth as a human species. So, humans are walking around, they're figuring out how to do things and to do it more efficiently, getting certain types of shortcuts. And so, but then, as you said earlier, it's probably the most terrible time for humans, right? We had all these diseases. And so one of them during this period was the spread of disease through fecal-oral transmission. And so how, I guess, understanding this new phase for humans, how did humans in a new ecology of farming, small villages, towns, living in close proximity to animals, create that challenge? And was it just simply that humans didn't have an understanding of that? Hey, we need to be more clean. We shouldn't have, feces next, or animals where they're, doing their business next to where we eat and all those things. Was it just an ignorance that humans just didn't realize that was part of the problem or something else? So just kind of talk about that expansion into an agrarian kind of society and the fecal-oral transmission.
Right. Well, you're hitting on one of my favorite topics. I think poop is the most neglected theme in most of our big histories of infectious disease. And I did get an academic press to let me write a lengthy chapter about poop. And I do have a lot of vocabulary variation and the different ways you can talk about it. But it's definitely stretched my thesaurus. But but to me, this is kind of a neglected chapter. And it's partly that everybody wants to move on to the big, sexy, explosive respiratory diseases that have names like measles and smallpox and so on.
Right.
And it's maybe partly because these diseases are less notorious. People don't know shigellosis. I find if you ask the average person what measles is, you can kind of muddle through an answer. If you ask the average person what shigellosis is, they have no idea what you're talking about. And that's insane, because the burden of shigellosis or bacillary dysentery in the human past and present is enormous. And humans suffer an unbelievable array of really nasty diarrheal diseases. And so as a historian and an ecologist, I want to say why. And the answer, I think, is ultimately rooted in this great shift that doesn't happen all at once or just in one place, but is this revolutionary transition from foraging to farming. And one of the aspects of that transition that hasn't, I think, had enough play in histories of disease is that it requires humans to create new kinds of environments, sedentary settlements. And once you settle down into a village or town, you are then going to the bathroom in your own environment and not moving along. Hunter-gatherers move along. And so humans that are sedentary are surrounded by their waste. But wait, there's more, because humans also domesticate other animals, which is just, unparalleled really in nature. And particularly, we domesticate large herds of mammals, large-bodied mammals. So then we're surrounded by their waste too. And so human farming settlements already in the early Neolithic, so the early period of farming, are what I call the greatest accumulation of interspecies scat in all of nature. There's nowhere else where there's so many different kinds of poop in one environment. And this is, from a parasite's perspective, this is a great opportunity because there are lots of gastroenteric diseases that have managed to figure out how to exploit the gut as an environment. And human settlements are bringing together, mingling human and animal waste, and we're living in it. Unlike herds of animals, we're not moving on. Unlike hunter-gatherers, we're not mobile. And so the waste gets into water, it gets into food. It's impossible to get rid of. And really, it's
Hmm.
it's been called the great ecological problem of human history. And conversely, I would say that clean water is the most fundamental health resource of all. And we take it absolutely for granted. It's a real privilege of living in developed, wealthy societies. But for most of the past, this was probably the greatest, most common source of infection. And children would have been just continuously exposed to new pathogens that were traveling from human waste and animal waste into their mouth, and it's sort of the ecological background for how humans got so many different diseases like shigellosis that are unfortunately kind of obscure, but I think it's important historically to try and get at the big question of why do we actually have so many diarrheal diseases and dysenteries? And today, we're still, even in privileged societies, we're still surrounded by it. I mean, I have 4 kids, and I can tell you, diarrhea when they go to school is just, the bane of existence. But at the same time, we're lucky because what we sort of endure in privileged societies is a kind of subset and a remnant of the relatively less dangerous. And we have good supportive care and know how to hydrate and treat different diseases. But really, in much of the world, this is still a major burden on human health, and particularly early childhood. Yes. And then throughout our past, it would have been one of the really major sources of disease burden.
Yeah, something we talk about, that you talk about later in the book, about in terms of in a modern age, about wealthier countries, usually being healthier, et cetera. But I do think about on this period of it on the planet is, much of this stuff still lives on. I think of major countries with lots of people that are pretty impoverished in different parts of the world, where they still have many of these issues and access to, no access to clean water, et cetera. It's you're right. It's how people don't talk about this enough. When I was reading the book, I was like, what have I been missing? What have I been not seeing, all this time? So I think it's really, it is I think one of the longer chapters, but it was really, really eye opening in many ways. And so this idea of the two things, right, that were key to spreading the diseases in agrarian society was density, so lots more people, and domesticates. And so you give the example of typhoid fever of working this way. Maybe you can just kind of use typhoid fever as a kind of example of how large amounts of people in place and kind of the domesticates are kind of the engine for some of the things of what we know about typhoid fever.
Typhoid's a really interesting disease because it's a gastroenteric, it's a disease that's transmitted by the fecal-oral route, and it invades via the gut. But it's actually not just a classic diarrheal disease, because it actually is so good at invading your body that it can just take over. And so the symptoms of typhoid are not primarily like other diarrheal diseases and dysentery. It's actually a fever that grips you from the inside out, but then takes over your whole body and makes you full of stupor and manifests on the skin and gives you excruciating pain and head pain. And what's weird about typhoid, to start with, is there's actually 4 agents of typhoid or paratyphoid fever that are 4 distinct species of a relatively common kind of gut bacterium. So we've managed to get this disease in the form of these different species over and over and over again. So it just is a reminder that humans create these waste environments, and these would probably originate as gut parasites of animals that then we're sharing space and environments with animals, and their microbes are adapting to us. And these are pathogens that really come to specialize in the infection of humans. They evolve and they get really, really focused on us. And typhoid is another disease that I think probably doesn't have the notoriety it deserves. It was a major cause of morbidity and mortality, even until really the relatively recent past. Actually, typhoid's one of the kind of hangers on, even in developed societies. In the United States, tuberculosis, which is a respiratory disease caused by a bacterium, it's an amazing disease, a huge, huge burden on humans even today. And probably, I mean, tuberculosis would be up there, one of the top couple of diseases for causing death throughout our history.
Yeah.
But typhoid is, along with tuberculosis, one of the last really, really big infectious diseases to be conquered in places like Western Europe and the United States. I mean, down in the early 20th century, it was one of the leading causes of death still, until cities figure out how to provide good sewage systems that remove waste and treat waste, and good water treatment. So particularly chlorination and chloramination that we still rely on. You can take a drink of water from your faucet. You don't have to worry about it. If you're in, Oklahoma or somewhere where you're lucky to have good civil infrastructure, but we are really privileged and too easily take that for granted. And typhoid is one of the really big reasons. It was a major disease throughout our past.
Yeah, it's a kind of a subplot throughout the book is, how much it's like taking for granted all these things. You turn on the faucet, turn on the lights, you turn on, waste management. If you live in a westernized or modern country, these things really do help us to keep us safe and not getting sick as easily. And so it's a really, if you're kind of thinking about the application of it, it's really a helpful reminder of how far we've come from some of these things. You talk about the evolution of measles, which had a little bit of a spotlight on it a year or two ago. There's a certain part of the United States that had a measles outbreak. You talk about measles later in the book, but at this point you talk about how measles originated as an airborne virus, so kind of one of the more sexier respiratory viruses, if you will, that people know about and talk about and all these things. Mm-hmm. And that as an airborne virus, it's through coughing, sneezing, infectious droplets, etc. And you say in there is this one line of something along the lines of, because humans exist, measles exist. It's very much a human kind of disease. I was wondering why that is, or how can that be? And a more specific question to that is it just mass amounts of people in one place that are spreading? So someone coughs and they have it and then they give it and it's in the air and then, people catch it and it's I think it's a 1 to 16 ratio. One person does it, 16 people are going to get it, whatever. Is it just that? Is it that there's a space for, there's a lot of lungs there, so it's going to find it and it's just going to sit there because it has places to live in? Or how does the actual ability for it to spread so rapidly kind of work and things like that?
Yeah, the measles virus is fascinating, and it's a freak of nature. I mean, it shouldn't be allowed to exist because it has a really terrible evolutionary strategy that only works if you have a primate that's living in populations of hundreds of thousands of people in very, very close proximity. What I mean is this: measles is a viral disease spread via the respiratory tract. It is one of the most contagious diseases known. I mean, it's just amazing. It's kind of like the Delta variant of SARS-CoV-2, which is unbelievably contagious. Measles is up there and possibly even beyond. If you have a room of people who are not vaccinated for measles and who are susceptible, who've not been exposed prior and have natural immunity, somebody walks in with measles, they start breathing, they're all going to get measles.
That's
I mean,
insane.
it's just.
Is it the most infectious on the planet?
Measles is considered. Yeah, I mean, it's a question I'd want to do my homework. You know how I am with footnotes, but measles is certainly usually cited as the kind of tail end of what we know of in terms of it's R naught. It's the number of people it infects, and so the problem with that, if you're the measles virus, is that survivors are given basically lifelong resistance. So the immune system remembers measles, remembers what measles look like, and it can snuff it out. So it confers very strong resistance. This is also why the measles vaccine is very effective, generally lifelong resistance to measles. The measles vaccines developed in the mid 50s and really takes this disease from extremely prevalent and very large cause of morbidity. Mortality had already declined. Measles is a pretty severe disease. But if you have a well-nourished population and good systems of even just basic supportive care, it doesn't have to be a cataclysmic disease. In the past, where you do have societies that have a lot of other infections and people are sick and they're hungry and they're poor, measles can be a pretty dangerous disease. But it had already declined, and the vaccine helped almost eliminate it from the United States and eliminated it across most of the United States. Unfortunately, anti-vaccine nonsense, as you mentioned, had grown even before COVID had amped it up even further. And maybe we'll talk about that. But the measles virus has sort of started making a comeback, which is just extremely frustrating because it doesn't have to be that way. But so it confers very strong resistance. Your body can recognize it, snuff it out, you won't get infected. So measles spreads too fast and confers resistance. It will go extinct really, really quickly in small populations. And there's a lot of empirical data and mathematical modeling of this. And it requires hundreds of thousands of people living in proximity for it to have enough hosts to keep circulating. So measles couldn't have existed before we built really big cities. And what's cool is now that we have a deeper understanding of its genome, measles looks to be roughly 2,500 years old, that it diverged from an ancestor that it shared with a closely related virus that incidentally caused disease in cattle. And so it probably sort of started adapting to humans and becoming measles as we more or less know it around the time that humans figured out how to build really big cities. So it would go extinct if it didn't have big populations, and it seems to have taken advantage very quickly of human social development and the rise of very large cities. So it's a cool way in which the genetic evidence kind of fits with what we know about human technology and social history. And it's just a neat story about ecology and how we create the evolutionary opportunities that our germs then seize.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how there's certain components. There's all these darker sides. There's many good things about building cities and domesticating plants and animals, and the fact that we're very social. But then there's also these kind of risks or cons to them in terms of disease. Real quick about bats and rodents. You talk about zoonotic leaps. Obviously, this is a huge thing. Is it the fact? Many people have been talking about this now more recently, obviously. But is it the fact that bats, rodents, and humans are all in the mammalian tree, and so that there's so many of these animals? I think bats are super numerous on the planet. Rats are super numerous. And obviously us humans, there's almost 8 billion of us. Is it just the fact that, again, kind of the same thing, and when we're looking at various diseases that they carry that are maybe endogenous to them initially, then there's enough, we're close enough on the tree compared to other organisms on the planet, the evolutionary tree, and the fact that there's so many of us and that we have lung capacity and all these other things to live for another reason? Or how do you understand the kind of zoonotic leap of, like, why wouldn't it, if someone gets bitten or something like that, or the tick or the vector-borne, it wouldn't survive for humans? Is it just because of that link of us in the mammalian tree in the large numbers, or something else?
Yeah, I mean, that's I think the basic story, and I think there are some elements of it that are still not completely understood. But it starts with that bats and rodents are mammals, and they're extremely speciose and numerous. There's lots of different species of bats and rodents. They really rule the world in numerical terms. There's bats and rodents collectively account for something like 3/5 of all mammal species. And then they build huge societies. They're very social. Particularly bats are capable of building really, really large populations. And as you say, they're mammals, so they're kind of closely related to us. Pathogens, microparasites are spreading all throughout all animals. It just happens that there's a lot of bats and rodents in the world. They live in large groups. And I think we're finding out as we've done more and more surveillance to understand what microbes are circulating in wild animal populations, bats and rodents keep popping up, partly because they're being sampled, but partly because there's lots of them and they have lots of germs. And these are the ultimate or proximate evolutionary source of a lot of our pathogens. And really, there's, one of the stimuli to do more sampling of wild animal populations really came from the first SARS-1, as well as the Ebola scares. Mm-hmm. And so over the last 15 years or so, there's been a lot of efforts to go out, get samples from wild animal populations, find out what species and kinds of pathogens they have, and to trace how they're related to human pathogens. So the first SARS was in some ways kind of a wake-up call. And what's kind of frustrating is, we were warned to watch out for these kinds of viruses, and even particularly coronaviruses that cause respiratory disease that adapt to humans from bats. So this pandemic kind of happened where we were told we should be most concerned. But it's a story with a deeper history. It's not something new that a lot of our diseases are caused by microbes that adapt to humans from wild animals, and particularly these small animals.
Yeah. No, yeah. The kind of the signs ahead that, there's some people have been talking about superbugs, and there's so many that are potentially out there, and we should be more prepared. And this idea of, like many things in our society, this reactionary kind of response is just not going to do well for us in the long term. But you talk about a large amount in the book. Obviously, it's huge, about the plague, which was super interesting. I had no idea that there were these kind of 3 phases of the plague pandemic. You say in 541 to 44 AD, and then 1346 to 53, and then in the 1800s. So a few sub questions here. So how do we understand the plague as never really going away, at least during that time period, but kind of sort of rising up over various periods in time? And then you could talk about the role of rats in spreading the plague, and how it, almost took out half the population on the planet at the time.
Yeah, I mean, you can't write a history of disease without giving the superstar its due. And when we're talking about the plague, we're talking about a specific disease that's caused by a bacterium. The bacterium is named Yersinia pestis. It is, first of all, it's the worst. There's a lot of really terrible diseases, but there's nothing that's caused the magnitude of mortality over short periods of time and big space that the plague has. So the plague is really distinctive in my mind as a historian of disease for causing the most severe mortality shocks in the history of our species. And it's still, I really think, mind-boggling. There's a lot we know about plague. It's one of the most studied infectious diseases because it's a big deal, because it's a huge bioterror threat, because it caused the biggest outbreaks of disease in our past. There's also a lot we don't totally understand about this pathogen. And what we can say about it are a few things that maybe make it weird. It's not a human disease. All of these other diseases we've talked about have adapted to humans, and they're really capable of sustaining transmission between human hosts. Plague cannot. It's an animal disease from start to finish, and particularly it's a rodent disease that is permanently established in wild rodent populations, mostly in Asia, although in small pockets of Africa and the Western United States, where you should never eat prairie dogs. The plague it's permanently present in wild animal populations, and repeatedly throughout our past, it's spilled out and caused these big human pandemics. Conventionally, there are 3 really big pandemics. We're actually learning from the archaeology and archaeologists that recover the genomes of bacteria from archaeological samples that plague's actually been around and infecting humans longer than we had known from the historical evidence alone. So the conventional 3 pandemics actually understates the scope of our relationship with this disease. But once at the end of the Roman Empire and beginning of the Middle Ages, from the 6th to 8th century, the first pandemic, the second pandemic starts with the Black Death, maybe, although there's some ideas now that it may have started a little bit earlier, but famously in the 1340s, it spreads throughout the Near East, North Africa, Europe, and maybe even beyond. And then it recurs every half generation or generation for something like 400 years, longer in parts of the Near East. And then the third pandemic spreads out of southern China over the 19th century and then reaches Hong Kong in 1894 and spreads in some parts of the world, but is actually quashed by human intervention and doesn't flare up to be the worldwide pandemic that it threatened to be. And then plague still lurks. It's still out there. You can get it in the Rocky Mountains. You can get it in Inner Asia. You can get it in Madagascar. It's a weird disease because it's a rodent disease. We can't tell the story of plague, I think, without including the black rat, which is an important species of rodent that is sort of like our shadow and nemesis that really thrives on human settlements. And again, it's one of those things that's kind of easy for us to forget or fail to really understand today. But rodents have been really ubiquitous in our cities and throughout our past. And it's a vector-borne disease. This is kind of the last really just mind-boggling thing about it. It's spread by fleas. And this is probably the major route of transmission, that rat fleas jump off of dying rats and they get so desperate that they'll drink human blood, which apparently doesn't taste as good to them. But, when it's your only option, they're hungry. The bacterium is evolved to be very good at transmitting via the flea bite. It may also be able to spread directly between humans, or it certainly can. And this may have been important in some of the historical pandemics in the past, that pneumonic plague, so when it gets into the lungs, can be expelled on droplets that can infect directly from person to person. So it's a crazy disease, and it's very well attested, particularly in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, what a destructive disease it was. It really does seem to have killed half the population over the span of entire continents at times. Not always, but in the really biggest outbreaks. And it's just an amazing biological and social event to try and even wrap your mind around. So got to tell the story of plague and put it in ecological terms as a product of human relationships with wild rodents and black rats, the habitats we build that allow rats to thrive, the communication and transportation networks we build that allow the disease to spread so rapidly, the biology of this unique bacterium that is so good at spreading via flea bite and so deadly when it infects humans. It's a zoonotic disease. It really, in evolutionary terms, doesn't care about us, doesn't care if it kills us, because we're not the host. We cannot sustainably transmit the disease that has to live in rodent populations. So in the chronicles of human disease, plague really does stand out.
Yeah. I had one specific question about the second pandemic, I believe, and the spread. You mentioned the Mongols crossing the steppe, is this correct? And
right.
And the steppe region, which was a regional ground zero, if you will, for the second pandemic, which is, I believe, something more new information that we've realized over the past couple of decades. So how did the spread over the Golden Horde contribute to the further spread and killing of almost half the population of the planet?
Well, again, this is an area where we're learning a lot, and there's still, I think, a lot to be learned. The genetics of the plague bacterium, Y. pestis, have been very well studied, and particularly from the field of archaeogenetics. So again, scientists who work with skeletal remains and can extract DNA of humans and sometimes the pathogens that killed them, and have given us a really remarkable picture of the evolution of this bacterium. And we used to not even really know where its ancestral home was. It's now, I think, very clear that it's Central Asia, and in particular the steppe and regions bordering the steppe, this long ribbon of treeless grassland that stretches from Hungary to Mongolia, and has been used as a highway of connectivity for nomadic peoples like the Mongols. So one of the great empires built by Genghis Khan, at the head of a nomadic or herding society whose economic base is not agriculture, but is herding animals. And they're a tremendous force, destructive force, that descends on Central Asia in the 12th century and on. And I think we now know that this is where the plague came from, and it followed their invasion and takeover of the steppe and its adjacent territories, and that probably it's the ecological changes that are set in motion by the Mongol expansion that allow the plague to really expand, and we can now see in its evolutionary history that it undergoes a rapid diversification. So something's happening in the evolutionary history of the bacterium from the time when the Mongols take over Central Asia. So that's more than just a correlation that's random. There's some deeper ecological connection, and there's a lot of work going on now to try and figure out why this seems to have sparked this evolutionary moment in the bacterium. It's certainly facilitated the transmission of the disease from this giant empire that soon split up into sub kingdoms that still remain highly connected and connect the Muslim world of North Africa and the Near East with the Christian world of Europe, and even with the world of Southern Asia, Central Asia, and East Asia. So it creates this big world system that certainly helps the plague move around.
Yeah, that's really, really, really helpful to understand kind of sort of the etiology of it, or the kind of the origins of it, and then kind of how it still persists in terms of how we understand kind of that connected world. So moving to the third part of the book is you talk about frontiers. So how do we understand many things in which disease spread as we're moving through time? And a big section here is the Colombian exchange with all of its perils. There are four major variables in the spread of disease in the Americas that you talk about. One, the timing, intensity, and nature of European contact. Two, population density of natives. Three, latitude and altitude. Four, ecological transformation. How did those four variables push the spread of disease? Was it just the spread of various domesticated animals and plants? Was it new animals and new environments? Just kind of describe how those four variables pushed the spread of disease.
Well, the Colombian exchange you mentioned, important to define that, is this really important phase in the history of life on the planet that starts in 1492, when Europeans start regularly crossing the Atlantic Ocean, and human connectivity brings into biological contact the biota, all forms of life in the old world and the new that had been largely separate for so long. And this includes connecting people, but also connecting diseases, connecting plants, which are a fundamental part, going all ways. Sugar coming to the new world, potatoes coming to the old world, plants and animals. And so that is this huge moment in the ecological history of the planet. And I think actually in some ways this little chapter in the history of disease is probably more familiar than a lot of chapters, because it's received a lot of popular elaboration by people like Jared Diamond and Alfred Crosby and William McNeill, who are all good public communicators and received wide readerships for books that helped popularize the notion of the disease exchange as part of an integral part of the encounter between old world and new world. And it was certainly, as you were saying, an imbalanced exchange, simply because the populations of the old world were larger, they were older, and there had been more time for diseases to evolve. They're more interconnected, largely because of transportation technologies and particularly animals. There are more domesticated animals. There are very few animals that are domesticated in the New World. There are camelids in South America, a species of duck in Central America, turkeys, guinea pigs. That's about it. Compared to horses, donkeys, cows, sheep, goat, pig, dogs, and so on in the old world. So there's just a very lopsided disease exchange. It's not clear that any new diseases from the New World are introduced to Africa and Europe and Asia by the Colombian exchange. It's not impossible. I'm just saying we don't have any definitive ideas of diseases that move that direction, whereas the diseases that are brought by old world peoples to the New World are many and tend to be highly virulent. But what I'm trying to do in the way that I tell the story is to really emphasize two dimensions of this moment that sometimes have been lost or not gotten, I think, adequate attention in the way this version of events has been popularized. One is that this is really a global story. And so it's not just Europeans bringing some diseases to the North America and South America that are very deadly for native populations. But it really is a global story. And so smallpox, when it shows up in the New World in the early 16th century, actually simultaneously becoming a much more serious disease in the whole rest of the world. And so I think it's in some ways lacking balance to focus on the devastation of smallpox in Mexico and South America in the early 16th century, which is surely hugely important. But at right the same time, smallpox is devastating Ming China. And so we shouldn't just see this one little piece or fragment of the bigger global story. And the other is to really try and make this an Atlantic story. And I think there's maybe been too much focus on the directly transmitted, particularly respiratory diseases of Europe, like smallpox, measles, diphtheria, coming to the New World, when really we need to bring in Africa and the dynamics of tropical disease, because one of the really important dynamics of the Atlantic system of exchange is the translocation of African biota, plants, as well as microbes, as well as insects, into the New World. And so particularly yellow fever, malaria, yaws, hookworm, diseases that come from the old world tropics and are introduced really suddenly to the New World and create a really powerful new disease environment really quickly in planetary terms, like the other dimensions of the Colombian exchange, that are sometimes sort of lost when people just focus on the big smallpox epidemics of the New World. But the long, deep story of malaria and yellow fever and their long-term demographic effects, their imprint on the economies of the slave trade and plantation agriculture and the complex relationships between plantation economics and the ecologies that they require, the transportation or the imposition of sugar production on the New World, which is a really profound ecological transformation that brings with it mosquitoes and diseases, and becomes so entwined with the economy of slavery, is a really important dimension of this story. So again, trying to get away from just the simplistic view that smallpox comes from Europe and is devastating in the New World, and put it in this bigger picture.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of the things we said in the beginning of the conversation about how we need to remember the impact of globalization at different points in our history, not just currently. And this sounds like it's one of those moments in history. Additionally, with that is, it's one particular section in the book that was really illuminating, was the impact of the slave trade on the spread of diseases. I think at some point in there, you it just kind of stuck out to me. I never really realized that more slaves were brought to the New World than immigrants, which is wild. And so understanding disease in the New World, you have to include almost an understanding of imperialism, colonialism, slave trade, health inequalities, etc. What are the major aspects under these themes that you could explain as contributing to disease in the New World from the Old World?
Well, I mean, as I was saying, I think one of the main storylines is the creation of disease gradients in the New World that create often really deadly landscapes where malaria and yellow fever have major demographic impacts on both settlers and enslaved persons, and over the long run really shape the dynamics of the societies that take shape in the New World, and particularly in much of the Caribbean and parts of South America, and especially Brazil. There's a really insidious relationship between the slave trade that transports not just unfree persons, but also plants and diseases into the New World tropics. And I mentioned sugar production, but let me go on a little bit about that, because sugar is really such a powerful force driving consumerism and capitalism. It's one of the great cash crops, most powerful cash crops in history. Its production is very destructive. It's a tropical grass, so it's only amenable to tropical climates that have the right environmental parameters, and it still requires deforestation because the fuel requirements of sugar production are so enormous. It's really conducive to a kind of brutal labor regime. It creates microenvironments that are almost unbelievably well suited to certain mosquito species, particularly Aedes aegypti, which has become a global mosquito thanks to the fact that humans are so good at spreading it everywhere, and is a major disease vector. And sugar plantations bring together human bodies. They're often deprived of adequate nutrition, vats of sugar, which is a gift to mosquito, as well as rotting sugar stalks, which is a gift to mosquitoes. Standing water in vats and tubs where the mosquitoes' eggs can be laid, in warm weather and often humid environments. So the ecological transformations required by sugar production create environments that are almost preternaturally suited for the transmission of mosquito-borne diseases, and particularly yellow fever, which is one of the kind of underrated diseases that really shapes the colonization of the New World in really profound ways.
Yeah, I was going to ask about yellow fever. You talk about how it has its origins in certain parts of Africa. And so I guess my question there, you kind of were alluding to it there, was, how do diseases that come from different parts of the world survive in other parts of the world when they are transported there in various ways? I also believe there's a kind of a family of these types of diseases. I think dengue is also very similar to yellow fever as well. Right. So how do we understand how diseases, when they come from one place and they go to another part of the world, they can still survive and happen? Is it just through the vector-borne stuff with mosquitoes, or is it something else? How does that?
Yeah, well, it depends, as always. It depends on a lot of things. And there are some diseases that are truly cosmopolitan. They are, like a cosmopolitan person that's as comfortable in, Tokyo or Johannesburg or New York or whatever. They don't really care where they are. And usually that's because their only environment is the human body. And so they're very good at infecting human bodies. 98.6 degrees. They know what they're in for. And it doesn't really matter if the human host is in Jamaica or Queens. It's irrelevant. And so like smallpox or measles, their transmission dynamics may be affected by environmental factors that shape human behavior, how often we're indoors, and that kind of thing. But they're not really that environmentally sensitive as organisms. Then there are other diseases that are very, very particular in their geographic potential, either because of the biology of the pathogen or because of the biology of the vector. And so in a case like take falciparum malaria, Plasmodium falciparum, which is the really, really, really bad form of malaria, it's exquisitely picky about its environment because it's dependent both on environmentally constrained mosquito vectors and because the organism itself will not be able to reproduce beyond certain temperature parameters. So falciparum malaria has throughout the human past largely been a tropical disease with sometimes arms reaching into the subtropics because it can't live anywhere else. And there's a number of diseases that share some of those qualities, either because of the pathogen itself or the vector. They can't adapt to other environments. Malaria is dependent on the transmission of species of mosquito in the genus Anopheles, and only I think it's like 70 different species can transmit malaria, and only 30 or 40 of them are really good at it. And wherever those mosquitoes happen to be have potential for malaria. And so this means that the geography of many diseases is shaped by geographic limits and geographic patterns.
Yeah, I think that's important to know because I think I've had people ask me like, well, why do some places have certain diseases but other places don't? But it's interesting about the mosquito where if there's people, it can for some it can definitely infect.
Right.
So moving to the last part of the book, which is really about modernity or diseases in the modern age and developed societies. There's a lot there in that section of the book. And so I definitely want to ask you about vaccines. But first, just kind of to set it up, how do you mentioned, and I said it earlier, that wealthier countries tend to be healthier and for poorer countries, it's the opposite. How do we just kind of understand the complexities of why that is?
Well, in one sense, the modern period, the last several centuries, is this amazing period of the human story where we get the upper hand and where life expectancies on average more than double globally, which is an amazing achievement that has reduced suffering and early death and allows people to reach their potential and relieves us of the anguish of death at an early age, and has been just one of the most amazing things our species has done. I'll talk about how we did it, but I think that's only sort of one side of a bigger story, and it'd be better to see modernity as kind of an ongoing arms race, because as we've multiplied and expanded and grown more connected and been more intrusive in nature, our diseases actually are constantly responding to these opportunities and getting new diseases are emerging constantly in the modern world. So it's one-sided to only narrate the chapters of modern history as kind of a constant human victory over a kind of group of enemies. Rather, it's back and forth. It's an arms race. And there's a lot of setbacks along the way. The 17th century, I try and tell, is sort of a period of enormous crisis and huge different parts of the globe that have really a biological dimension with infectious disease. Then there's the Enlightenment, and humans start to figure things out. But as we grow, there's actually a lot of setbacks, and these never get the attention they deserve in the 19th century. Even in Europe and the United States, the crude death rate goes up and infectious diseases actually kind of push back for a while. But then in the late 19th century, human progress driven by modern science becomes more systematic, and persistent gains are made first in Western Europe and its offshoots, and then more globally in the course of the 20th century. But even with the more systematic achievement of control of infectious disease, we never conquer them, and we never can conquer them because nature doesn't stand still and evolution is relentless and pervasive.
Oh, yeah.
And we've had lots of losses and setbacks along the way. Cholera and influenza A and polio, and of course AIDS, and now COVID-19. So I think it's better to see modernity as sort of this constant ratcheting up of pressure and adaptation and solution, new problem, better solution. And humans do gain systematic control, and that's really important. But COVID-19 stands in a very long line of near misses and devastating setbacks.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It reminds me of the Agrarian phase as well for humans on the earth. Of, again, it was super harmful for us. And much like now, and modernity is great for many things, but as you're saying, there's seemingly this paradox of urbanization, increased demographics, modern transportation technologies, pressure on natural resources are good for us in one way, but in another way, in terms of disease, it's terrible for us. And it's just so interesting how there isn't really, kind of what you're saying, the power of evolution and how things continue to adapt can sometimes be really harmful for us. I have one question about public health reform, but before that, maybe just talk to us about the important significance of germ theory. I know that was huge in terms of modern science. Why was that? What is it briefly, and then why was that so important for us?
Yeah, germ theory is the name we give to really a group of ideas that come together in the late 19th century. There had been precedents before this for people who said infectious diseases are caused by little invisible things that may be particle-like forms of life that get inside you and make you sick. But this was pretty marginal and outside mainstream science. And really most, both common as well as educated medical thinking held that disease was caused by imbalance, for instance, in the body's humors that might be triggered by changes in the environment or corruption of the atmosphere or pollution and filth and waste. And it really was a kind of mental breakthrough to realize that there were microscopic forms of life, like bacteria, that were invisible parasites that were the basic cause of infectious disease. And this is really a scientific paradigm that just grows and grows over the course of the 19th century. And it's usually most associated with the French scientist Louis Pasteur, who's famous for pasteurization of milk, but is also a huge figure in disproving spontaneous generation and developing the science of vaccine development. So he's a major figure in the story. And the German scientist Robert Koch, who really does more than anyone to discover bacteria, helps bring microscopes into the lab and literally be able to envision microbes that were causing human disease. It didn't convince everyone immediately, but I think in terms of the big picture, within a generation at the end of the 19th century, it went from being a fairly marginal and radical idea to being a quite apparently correct idea that gained consensus as time moved on. And this scientific breakthrough allowed humans to understand the problem and to address it in new ways, to pursue systematically the development of vaccines and pharmaceuticals, chemicals that can treat disease, like ultimately antibiotics, which come a little bit later, 1930s and particularly the 1940s. And insecticides, once we realized, make the connection between germ theory and vector transmission to control, for instance, mosquitoes. So it opened up entirely new and more systematic ways to try and control infectious disease.
Yeah. In terms of public health reform that was going on, I guess 19th going into the 20th century, is things like mandatory vaccination, food safety, labor laws, building zoning requirements, etc., along with increased hygiene, hand washing, other bodily norms for hygiene. How did these changes kind of come about? So as we understand more things, right, we were saying, well, we got to change some other things in how we do this, such as these two areas. How did that come about socially? Was there like pushback against that, or was it more readily accepted because people were getting sick and they didn't want to get sick, or how does that?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I mean, great question, and I think one lesson from the history of health is that technical solutions on their own are never enough, right. And we're relearning that the very, very hard way with our vaccines. And the continuing COVID-19 pandemic. But we should have known that from history as well, that it takes changes in cultural beliefs as well as social adaptations and changes in the state. And no, it was, I think, always controversial, but one of the changes that allows human societies to gain the upper hand over infectious disease is the mobilization of really massive public health politics in the course of the 19th and particularly very late 19th century that demands things like public provision of goods such as sewage and particularly clean water, and allows the state to do things like require vaccination. So we didn't conquer smallpox by doing our own research or looking up on Facebook whether it's safe. The state made people get vaccinated. It was controversial. But it's constitutional, and public health boards required vaccination, and smallpox went from being the single greatest disease in the 18th century to basically eliminated from places like the United States by the early 20th century. And it took both the technical marvel of vaccines as well as social changes and cultural understandings of science and how vaccines worked, but also smart policy that took population health seriously.
Yeah. Well, that goes to my next question, which was on vaccines. Obviously, it is still probably one of the things people talk about the most at the moment. So you list in the book 3 ways in which we measure the contribution of vaccines. 1, it reduces mortality. That's a good thing. 2, globalize good health pretty quickly. And 3, give humans control over new threats. So there's a lot of power in vaccines, right? There's so many benefits to vaccines. Just kind of, this is a broad question. You can hit it whichever way you want, but what is the kind of history of vaccines in the United States in terms of process and then how they're received? So it's kind of a part 2 to my previous question.
Yeah, and the point about vaccines, almost arriving too late to make a difference in the most economically developed societies is pretty important as a point, because the more than doubling of human life expectancy actually happens before most vaccines are developed, with the great exception of smallpox, which is the first and really most important vaccine. But as you said, then vaccines allowed good health to go global. So in the course of the 20th century, vaccination was a major tool to reduce infectious disease. And the third point is that they're the linchpin of our control. They're our best defense against, particularly against viral diseases that are otherwise often very difficult to treat with therapeutics. So we need vaccines. They're the linchpin of our control over constantly emerging biological threats. And yet, from the very beginning, there's been resistance. Vaccination was preceded by inoculation, which is a rather more dangerous medical intervention of intentionally infecting someone with smallpox material. Right. Smallpox was such a dangerous disease that it was generally worth the risk. And it did help control smallpox even before vaccination. But right from the beginning of inoculation, there was misinformation and challenge. And certainly even vaccination from the beginning inspired all sorts of opposition. And I mean, at one basic level, I think you can try and sympathize that there's something counterintuitive of sticking something that's related to a dangerous microbe in some way into your arm if you don't have the microbiology to understand what it's doing to your immune system and why it's safe. And the history of vaccination development hasn't been perfect. There've been some huge mistakes. I think fortunately, our scientific establishment and government regulatory bodies have learned a lot from those, but there's always going to be human factors. So I mean, you can try and sympathize with how people frame these decisions, but from the beginning, from the spread of vaccination, there's been misinformation and anti-science and opposition, and people claiming that it should be the individual's choice whether to be vaccinated. The reality is that public health is public, not private. Our health is interconnected. Societies can't eliminate diseases, whether it's smallpox or COVID-19, without, frankly, public requirements that coordinate our society and help protect the health of the public. What's strange to me as an observer living through a pandemic who writes about this history is that I think we'd been complacent, at least most of us had been complacent about the rising threat of anti-vax. It's a strange ideology. It's not one thing. There are different facets of it. I mean, for instance, one of the weird things is you're honestly is likely to find anti-vax ideology in a rural Oklahoma town full of evangelicals as a hippie, neighborhood in Portland, where you have very different approaches. So anti-vax isn't one thing. But you mentioned the measles outbreaks. That maybe should have been a warning sign. And there were people who were blaring the horn. My friend Peter Hotez was really, really vocal about this before COVID-19. But COVID-19 has been weird in that it's gotten polarized, not just in America, but in other places as well, although I think particularly bitterly here. Yeah. And things like mask requirements and vaccines have been not just politicized, but really polarized. And that's very unhealthy. And I think it's given anti-vaccination a kind of scope and purpose that goes way beyond what it looked like 3 or 4 years ago. And I worry that's going to be one of the kind of really immediate term things we have to grapple with in a very sympathetic, but hopefully very serious way. Because if we backslide on vaccinations, it's not just that COVID-19 will linger and take who knows what turns, but other diseases like measles could rear their head in uglier ways. And really, protection against measles is just not an individual choice. It requires a very, very large percentage of the population to be vaccinated to keep it at bay. Yeah. That's just one example. So I think the way that polarization has kind of the SARS-CoV-2, this virus has sort of infected our worst cultural tendencies. And I think we have to find our way out of that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think in terms of vaccines, what I kind of break this down to in my observation is it really just comes down to trust in two different ways, or lack of there. Is many people don't trust what institutions or what experts or what scientific entities are saying, and look, all of those, institutions have had plenty of missteps. They get it wrong. They have mistakes, 100%, like anybody or like any institution. But I think there's just a distrust in particular groups and people and institutions, and so I think that's just one big piece of it. And I think when I ask anybody that is not going to get the vaccine or they don't want to, the argument that I usually hear is, well, I just don't know the long-term effects. And it doesn't matter if you spell out many of the things, like, yeah, but we don't know. And I don't want to put something foreign in my body that I don't know what it could do to me, which is another type of distrust in terms of, just the vaccine itself, which I can hear that. I mean, I think at the end, right, a vaccine might be a little bit better than getting the virus, but for some people that's not. I also think because the virus for a lot of people has been very, some people are asymptomatic. It hasn't been that bad. It's, the sniffles and a cold over a weekend and people are fine. That's not everybody. I mean, obviously, in the United States, we're over 600, 700,000 people have died from it tragically, but there are other people that get it and it's not really that big of a deal. I think if it was something like Ebola, where people are bleeding out of their eyes, potentially, people would be lining up for a vaccine. Now, I could be totally wrong on that, but
yeah, I'd like to think you're right. I mean, one of the few mercies of this disease is that it's relatively not severe in pediatric cases, and you would like to think, although the last year hasn't always inspired optimism in our institutions and culture, but you would like to think if this disease were cruel for children and young people, that that we would handle it in a different way. But there will be another pandemic, and I think we have to come together as hopefully as this continues to be brought under greater control and more people are vaccinated, and find some way of disentangling this from our social polarization. And you use the word trust several times, and that's exactly right. I don't think 10, 20 years ago, most people got the measles vaccine because they'd done their own research or
right.
read the FDA regulatory documents. They trusted the family doctor, and they knew it was what you did. And as you said, just the nearness to some of these disease experiences, and particularly polio, not so long ago, that was an absolutely terrifying specter over American society, and the salvation that the polio vaccines brought in the late 50s was a fresh memory. And I think in some way, and polio was so devastating for children and such a tragic disease that it scared the heck out of people and made them realize that they needed to trust what science was offering. But the memory of that's maybe decayed. And the terrors of polio have kind of been sort of receded with time. So in any case, I think what you said about trust is very well said.
Yeah, I also think it was probably helpful in trying to have better public health about it that, a very loved U.S. president was in a wheelchair because of polio. I think just the optics of that alone were just kind of like, yikes, this is really, our leader or whatever is impacted by it. So I think that, but I agree. I think time is weird and it fades and we forget and the kind of potency of things. My last question for you is, we've kind of a little bit been talking about COVID-19. My just general question is, I can't, you wrote a very awesome book about the history of disease on the planet. Where does COVID-19 fit within the history of disease and pandemics? Where does it fit in the kind of lineage of that? Where I mean, it's still early. We're still going through it. Who knows? But as of right now, with you at the pure historian's hat on, where does COVID-19 fit in terms of disease, pandemics, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question and really a hard one, because our technical, our scientific capacity is so remarkable. And our ability to manage COVID clinically is so amazing, and just the quality of care that our frontline health workers provide. And there are plenty of systemic problems in our healthcare system, but the quality of training and the esprit de corps of our medical infrastructure, and the amazing science that's allowed management of the disease, and then obviously the vaccines, make it kind of hard to compare.
Sure.
So I tend to think that with the really, really fundamental point that it doesn't cause nearly as much severe disease in young people. Otherwise, COVID is a pretty nasty disease. It's amazingly contagious, particularly as it's evolved. And it's pretty severe. I think that'd be more apparent even a generation or two ago. Just the ability to manage the disease has kind of obscures a little bit of its severity, even despite the fact, as you say, that 700,000 Americans have died so far, 1 in 500 people, 1 in 400 people in places like Oklahoma. So, it's pretty severe. But what's maybe scary is that this is the first big new respiratory disease in a while that kind of made the leap, got inside us, got really well adapted to transmitting between humans. And there is a lot of space for it to be more virulent. So evolution will keep moving, and that opportunity space for diseases that are as transmissible as COVID-19, but cause even more severe disease, is still out there. And I think it's only a matter of time. We don't know if it'll be a year or 100 years where some pathogen is going to take advantage of the fact that there are 8 billion of us that live in cities that have a population that's 4 times the number of humans that existed at the dawn of the Holocene, where jet travel means that we're basically one meta population. We're basically one population of 8 billion people. So the really fundamentals of that, I think, urge us to believe that there'll be another pandemic, that it could be worse. And so it's really, really urgent that we come together and think about how to prepare, because, as I said a moment ago, we were warned, but it's hard to take seriously those warnings. Humans, we all struggle with risk calculations, and these are kind of strange ones. And scientists can't tell us if the next pandemic is going to be in a year or 100 years. But we will hopefully have the chance to come together for mature reflection on how we can both improve our science, but also maybe our social response to the inevitable next one.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Well, look, Kyle, you've been super generous with your time and your energy and your knowledge. It's such a privilege to talk to you. Where can people find your book and any of your research, and all the relevant places online? Where's the best place to find you?
Thanks. The book is called Plagues Upon the Earth. It's out from Princeton University Press. So you can of course find the book's link on their webpage. It's easy to find if you Google it. There are some major online booksellers that I'm not going to give any free advertising from my lips, but it won't hurt my feelings if you buy my book from them. But best of all would be to support your local bookstore and call them and have them order a bunch of copies. That'd be my best recommendation. I have a personal website that I update occasionally with links to material that I find interesting or things I've written. It's kyleharper.net, and also has links to the book.
That's great. Really, it was a absolute blast talking to you. I really, really enjoyed it. I know some of this content's a little bleak sometimes, but I think it's super important for how we understand things and for people to have really good information. I really can't say enough wonderful things about your book. It really was fabulous, and everyone should buy it. So thank you so much for letting me talk to you and ask you a bunch of questions and just really good dialogue. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. A great conversation. I appreciate your kind words.
All right. Thank you.